All right, welcome back to another episode of Strife's Talking Points. I'm watching this live. I've had to back up a little bit here, but you have on your screen there Senator Bernie Sanders, who is running for president, and he's going to give his democratic socialism speech. And I'm going to go through it as he does. This will probably be a fairly long video. I overall like Bernie. However, I believe he's sort of losing his way in the current version of the democratic identity politics and the reality that the world is pushing back against globalism. People are becoming more nationalist, they're becoming more populist. They want their government to focus on the people born in the nation, the actual citizens, more than they care about the unfettered immigration, or basically some of the what you hear out of Europe is sometimes the takeover of their states by foreign people. Keep in mind that a couple hundred years ago, the first rise of what you call the nationalists were the people pushing out the colonial powers, Britain, France, Germany, all these various colonial powers, Spain, as these nation states started to form, as the citizens decided they wanted to rule themselves, and they wanted the governments kind of to take care of the people, not the homeland or this other country where people were coming from, and they basically had preferred rights to the citizens of the peoples, not citizens. They weren't citizens until after they were basically nationalized and turned into their own country. However, in the last few years, that word has been taken very negative. And I'm just going to play a little bit here. Of course, this is live on CBS if you want to go watch it, which is where I'm catching it from. I do enjoy watching CBS, even though a lot of times I disagree with what they're saying. But here we go, real quick.
The movement toward oligarchy runs parallel to the growth of authoritarian regimes, like Putin in Russia, Xi in China, Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, and Viktor Orban in Hungary.
Now, Bolsonaro, Orban in Hungary, Duterte, these are all people held up by the left-wing media that were elected because the countries were basically having mass failures. In Brazil, especially, they were under basically a socialist government rule for decades, and it was worse and worse and worse and worse. And finally, the people decided we have to change what's going on. So they elected him, and they've moved forward some. He's going to bring back gun rights because there are so many shootings and stabbings there. He's going to re-empower the police and kind of move forward with more nationalist, more right-wing policies of distributing power back kind of to the people out of the hands of the government. Hungary is being attacked. I've actually done a series on it myself, where they have decided not to allow unfettered immigration to the country. They're barring entrance. They're moving people around. They are not going to allow their country to be basically colonized by a foreign state. They say that Hungarians are themselves a people. They deserve the right to exist, and they want their country to be for them. And they're very much resisting the EU and its appeal kind of towards that extreme immigration policy you kind of have going on now. We're going to move forward.
Among others. These leaders meld corporatist economics with xenophobia and authoritarianism.
Now, all of these leaders have been democratically elected. Right now, are corporatist politicians. Now, I would say that Bernie's dead on the money there, especially in the U.S., where we have these essential corporate elites donating millions and millions of dollars into the political system here in the U.S., various lobbyists, and I want to show this here real quick. This is the oil and gas, the fossil fuel industry, basically. Their donations. You'll see Coke Industries did $10 million, $6 million for Matheron, and they are generally donating to Republicans. And you see here, the biggest one, though, is $10 million, and they go down. So you may have, $100 million-ish there, probably quite a bit less overall. And then I'm going to go to, and this is the one everybody targets, is fossil fuel industry, and they own our government. Well, here's finance and real estate. Now, by sector, The largest contributor is $10 million to conservative, then to Republican. So they're kind of going, that's like $10 million. Bloomberg alone, financial, $95 million to liberal political action groups. 95 million. That outpaces the entire oil and gas industry in one shot. Completely. Palomar Partners, again, that is almost half, or that's better than the top three right off the bat. One hit larger. Citadel is the only one who seems to go conservative in the large side. And you see these finance companies are very much dominated in the liberal category. These top two will outpace the rest on their own. Single issue voters. This is something here where it's ideology, American Action Network, conservative parties, conservative parties, conservative parties. And you still don't see the amount of money finance has in our political system. I pulled up this other one here, which shows finance, ideology, single issue, other, miscellaneous business, health, communications, law. This is a huge issue in the U.S., although the traditional targets are the oil and gas, when I really think it should be the finance group. But because they donate liberal, you don't really hear them talked about on the mainstream media as a big issue in politics. But I've always thought corporate lobbying, companies being people, I don't agree with that at all.
They redirect popular anger about inequality and declining economic conditions into violent rage against minorities.
Now, in the U.S. right now, most of our media cycles around drumming up new rage. You see it in Biden. You see it in most of the political discussions. You see it on CNN every night, where they attack anyone they can as racist, sexist, homophobic, misogynist. The ists, they are using all of them they can all the time. This is a corporate media tactic where they want to make you afraid, want to make you angry. And it's been going on since, well, I'm fairly old now, and it's been going on my entire life. And Bernie is saying that it's these people on the right, these nationalists, these populists, who are channeling that anger. I kind of see it a little differently. I think all this anger is being drummed up all over the place. And these populists have answers that say, hey, we are a country. We have a right to exist. We should take care of our people. And the minority groups, in the U.S. alone, the minority groups have special privilege for being in the U.S. And the extension is that those privileges need to be extended and heightened, greatened, ingratiated, and pushed forward more and more and more. Which, when you take this class of people and then put them above all other classes, and even like YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, call them protected groups. Groups you can't criticize, groups you can't go after, groups you can't say things about unless you have, and if you do, you'll have the dreaded ists thrown at you, and they throw them liberally at everyone who has any state. And if you are a member of those minority groups and you speak out against this greater party, the liberal party, the more now the far left than I would say the liberal group, you get those same things hurled at you as a member of the minority group. So the protection only works if you stay in line with the accepted views. And for that, you can look at the Hodge twins. They're black conservative men. You can look at Candace Owens. She gets attacked very regularly. You could look at various members of the Jewish faith who are attacked openly and called Nazis because they are Jews and they don't support this further left agenda.
Whether they are immigrants, racial minorities, religious minorities.
Now, religious minorities is an odd thing. Most people do not understand that when in the U.S. we're discussing religious minorities. In the U.S., over the last few months, we've had lots of talk about various religious groups. And I'm actually planning on trying to set up a video with Axios coverage of the Google, Sundar Pichai, who's the CEO of Google, and what he said. it is very difficult for you to take religious groups and separate them, because most religions that you think of as a religion, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, are basically considered Abrahamic religions, and they have a similar core set of values. And those values are very much against what you would consider the progressive agenda for the U.S. The agenda you hear on from the left now is very different than the agendas you see taking part in those religious, primarily single-focused religious countries. The West is one where Christianity, the major religion, is kind of separate and does poke itself into the government from time to time, but is generally beaten back and pushed back by the secular ideas that we ourselves hold to be true for how the country should function.
Or the LGBT community.
Now that some of the religious minorities he's referring to directly oppose that. You have all kinds of stuff all around the world where if you look up LGBTQ rights, that's something that exists in the West and we are proponents of in the West. However, as you go around the world, you won't see that because that group is protected in the West, and although it only makes up, roughly 4% of the population, they have gotten, that's a very place. They have gotten special treatment in the West, and it doesn't translate to what you see in the Asia, the Middle East, and a lot of other countries. You just don't see that type of treatment there, and generally you see the converse. But you're not seeing the push towards doing that there, except by, strangely enough, Donald Trump, who's been trying to get decriminalization of homosexuality for the last couple of years, and it never makes the news, and it's always getting pushed back, and it's always used as he's trying to tokenize us, when if you could force that decriminalization around the world, I think that would be a great thing myself.
And to suppress the set, they are cracking down on democracy and human rights.
Now, everything now by the people like Bernie is a human right. Every right, everything. Education's a right. Healthcare's a right. Everything becomes a right. Whenever you think about human rights, I like to think of it as, what rights do you have if you're completely alone in the middle of nowhere? You have the right to speak. No one there is there to stop you. You have the right to bear arms if you have it. You have the right to group up if you can find people. It's kind of a strange way to look at it because of all the other human rights now are being added on and added on and added on. The authoritarians are part of the socialist movement. You see the authoritarians breaking down barriers, saying they need to gatekeep media, they need to gatekeep news, they need to gatekeep everything. If you are someone who they disagree with, you are essentially unpersoned. Now, I've never heard in years and years of watching the news where the Conservative Party or anyone with more or less views from the right try to deperson someone and saying this person should never have a job, they should never be able to apologize, they should never have any of that. Those are all things you see coming out of the left, especially out of the Twitter group. And Twitter, although it is an interesting place to be, has no real authority except to confuse people who don't really understand what Twitter is and force them to capitulate to the Twitter mob of 14 angry people.
In the United States, of course, we have our own version of this movement, which is being led by President Trump and many of his Republican allies who are attempting to divide our country up and attack these very same communities.
Now, these very same communities are the ones most benefiting under the Trump presidency. If you don't study history and don't look at how the laws are passed, most of the major crime reform bills come through Democratic presidents, Democratic Congresses. They come through and then they are generally pushed via a group of individuals who are trying to limit harm to their communities. I believe Reagan is most famously known for passing a crime bill, which was brought up to him by the I believe it was the Black Religious Caucus or something like that, where they got together, helped him craft the bill. This is what we want to have done. And then, of course, once the implementation goes out, you can't have a group of people making up, 12% of the population, committing half of all violent crime and robbery, and not have it adversely affect that group. It is a very serious issue in our country, and one in which I hope someday they figure out a way to talk about without every conversation being just referred to as racist, which I'm sure this broadcast itself will be considered because I just brought up a FBI crime stat.
How sad it is that President Trump sees these authoritarian leaders as friends and allies.
These leaders have been elected by the people of their respective countries, and Europe is an ally of the U.S. Brazil is a long-term ally of the U.S. We've had good negotiation policies with China since, unfortunately, since Nixon went to China and kind of opened that up. These countries are the U.S. allies. You, as president, you need to be friends with them. You need to be friendly with them. And that's how we secure the world more and don't have, fighting all across.
The authoritarian playbook, by the way, is not new.
Now, Bernie here is going to go back for what we currently see is he is taking all of the history between the 1900s and the 1950s or 1960s and rolling it into one big block. It's all because of one group, and we're going to hear that shortly.
The challenge we confront today as a nation and as a world is in many ways not different from the one we faced a little less than a century ago during and after the Great Depression of the 1930s. Then as now, deeply rooted and seemingly intractable economic and social disparities led to the rise of right-wing nationalist forces all over the world.
Actually, it led to a lot of left-wing groups. Socialism rose in multiple countries all around the world. And as socialism rises, the counterpart to communism and utopian socialism is also a semi-socialist program called fascism. And when they go rise and ebb together, you had the rise of the communists, you have the rise of the socialists in Germany, in Italy, in Greece. You had all these different socialist parties starting to rise, and then the fascist parties, the more nationalistic parties, rose to counter them and led to mass bloody warfare.
In Europe.
That is before the actual European war broke out. Before. Bloody riots everywhere. They were killing each other in the streets, fighting. That was before World War II.
The anger and despair was ultimately harnessed by authoritarian demagogues who fused corporatism, nationalism, racism, and xenophobia into a political movement that amassed totalitarian power, destroyed democracy, and ultimately murdered millions of people, including members of my own family.
Now, that is a direct reference to the German National Socialist Workers' Party, the Nazis, as you would have to call them, not to pass by the thing. That party rose in counter, and it was as they say, it was non-socialist. It was also non-nationalist. It was a globalist party. Their ideas of how to fix their country was to invade everyone else. They were beaten back by countries like the U.S., where we have freedom of religion, freedom of the press, mass freedoms. And we united against them. And after the end of World War II, you actually have a greater death toll from the socialist countries after the war than you had during the war. I know that's hard for everybody to see, but the socialist countries couldn't function and they lost more lives after the war than during the war.
But we must remember that those were not the only places where dark forces tried to rise up and capture power. Today, we are all rightly repulsed by the sight of neo-Nazis and Klansmen openly marching.
There you go. Everyone is rightly repulsed. They have no authoritative power in the U.S. They have no support from any public official, any government, any news organization that's even considered remotely mainstream, even some that are not mainstream. No support whatsoever. They're chastised, they're pushed back, their ideas are completely made fun of because it is just so stupid.
In Charlottesville, Virginia, and we are horrified by houses of worship being shot up by right-wing terrorists.
Easter worshippers. 300 Easter worshippers killed in another country, and it was half a day's news, and that was it. They didn't even cover the one wife who was caught by police who blew herself up and her children to avoid being questioned or arrested.
But on February 20th, 1939, over 20,000 Nazis held a mass rally, not in Berlin, not in Rome, but in Madison Square Garden, in front of a 30-foot banner of George Washington bordered with swastikas in New York City.
Oh my God, how the country has changed in 80 years. Is that a surprise to anyone that our country would change over the course of 80 years? Not to me.
New York City. But back then, those American extremists could not replicate the success of their authoritarian brethren across the ocean. Because we in the United States, thank God, made a different choice than Europe did in responding to the era's social and economic crises. We rejected the ideology of Mussolini and Hitler, and we instead embraced the bold and visionary leadership of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, then the leader of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party.
Who was full on wanting to grow into socialism, however, he couldn't support the plans, and it wasn't until the outbreak of World War II that the U.S. began to recover, not based on the FDR plans, but based on the fact that most of the world competition was decimated economically. Europe was decimated, Asia decimated, Middle East decimated, North Africa decimated. The U.S. was one of the only surviving powers that could still produce without hindrance.
Together with organized labor, leaders in the African American community, and progressives inside and outside the Democratic Party, Roosevelt led a transformation of the American government and the American economy. Like today, the quest for transformative change was opposed by big business, by Wall Street, by the political establishment, by the Republican Party, and by the conservative wing of FDR's own Democratic Party. And he faced the same scare tactics then that we experience today.
No, that you're expressing today. You're trying to goad fear. You're trying to paint everyone who disagrees with you, put them on the same side as the Germans from 1939 and the New Yorkers from 1939, who I believe were, I know that some of the Democrats from back in the day supported that idea, and it was pushed out, and then basically everything German was negated after the fact, because once the war broke out, very patriotic fervor took over the U.S.
Red baiting, xenophobia, racism, and anti-Semitism.
So he's attacking the Women's March because they were known to be very anti-Semitic. He's attacking a lot of the liberal media newspapers because they publish very vehement anti-Semitic papers all the time. And red baiting and race baiting are going on everywhere because unless you don't know this, the South American countries that have millions of people coming to the U.S., the nation themselves, such as Mexico, is not a race. It is a country, a nation of origin, and saying that you want to get out illegal immigrants, these economic migrants, is not racist. It is just trying to be, I guess, populist, nationalist, where you want your own country to be for your people.
In a famous 1936 campaign speech, Roosevelt stated, and I quote, "We had to struggle with the old enemies of peace, business and financial monopoly, speculation, reckless banking, class antagonism, sectionalism, war profiteering. They had begun to consider the government of the United States as a mere appendage to their own affairs. We know now that government by organized money is just as dangerous as government by organized mob."
Now, keep in mind, this is the same party pushing to have the Electoral College pushed out so that a popular vote, essentially the mob vote, wins. I don't see how you could be so duplicitous as to put these two ideas in at the same time. The Electoral College is so that each state has its own right, each group of people, it's meant to protect the Union of the United States against the mob mentality, and it's done so very well for, 200 years.
And Roosevelt concluded, and I quote, "Never before in all our history have these forces been so united against one candidate as they stand today. They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred."
Now, keep in mind that the party he's speaking of, the Democratic president back in the day, Roosevelt, was the leader of the Democratic Party, the party that had basically been enacting the Jim Crow laws, had been restricting the rights of black citizens, had been doing all these terrible things that have now been kind of pushed off and said, oh no, we're not that party, we're a different party. During his time, Roosevelt would have been that type of, that was the party he was working through. Keep in mind, they were segregating military units, they were segregating openly all across the Democratic-controlled South. It is that group of people that continued this and that ran that he is taking his socialist agenda from. Now, I do like Bernie Sanders. I really wish he hadn't been cheated out of his candidacy for president by the Democratic National Convention, by the DNC, and he had been allowed to compete fairly and evenly. I really do think he would have taken the nomination. Maybe this time around he will, and then we will have a Bernie Trump 2020, which I feel will be very interesting. But, that's the first half of this video. It's 30 minutes long, so thank you for listening. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, or feel free to dislike the video. I'm not in charge of you, but I hope you have a wonderful day.